On the afternoon of June 26, 1944, at Hollandia Air Base in Dutch New Guinea, the tropical sun beat down relentlessly on the corrugated metal structures that housed American military operations. Inside one of these hastily constructed buildings serving as a recreation facility, Lieutenant Colonel Charles MacDonald of the U.S. Army Air Forces sat engaged in a game of checkers with another officer. The building, like most structures at this forward base, offered minimal protection from the heat that created visible distortions in the air above the runway. Without warning, a figure appeared at the entrance, a man whose presence at this remote military installation seemed implausible. Charles Lindbergh stood at the doorway, his fame preceding him even in this distant corner of the Pacific war zone. The man who had captured the world's imagination 17 years earlier by flying solo across the Atlantic Ocean now sought permission to observe and discuss combat operations involving the Lockheed P-38 Lightning fighter aircraft. MacDonald's initial reaction combined disbelief with confusion. Lindbergh held no military commission in 1944. His relationship with President Franklin Roosevelt's administration had deteriorated to the point where he had been effectively barred from military service. Yet here stood America's most celebrated aviator, thousands of miles from the continental United States, in the middle of an active war zone, requesting access to frontline fighter operations. Neither officer could have predicted that this chance encounter would fundamentally alter American air combat tactics in the Pacific theater. Over the following 6 weeks, Lindbergh would demonstrate fuel management techniques that extended the operational range of the P-38 Lightning by more than 30%. His methods would enable fighter missions previously deemed impossible and contribute measurably to the acceleration of American offensive operations across the southwestern Pacific. If you appreciate evidence-based World War II military history, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment indicating your location. We enjoy hearing from viewers worldwide. This transformation began not in 1944, but 17 years earlier over the Atlantic Ocean. On May 20, 1927, Charles Augustus Lindbergh departed Roosevelt Field, New York, piloting a Ryan NYP monoplane designated Spirit of St. Louis. 33.5 hours later, after traversing approximately 3,600 miles of open ocean, he landed at Le Bourget Field near Paris, France. Lindbergh had completed the first solo non-stop transatlantic flight, a feat that instantly elevated him to international celebrity status. However, Lindbergh's achievement represented more than courage or endurance. The flight demonstrated exceptional technical planning and precision fuel management. Spirit of St. Louis carried 450 gallons of aviation fuel, so much that forward fuel tanks completely obscured the pilot's direct forward vision. Lindbergh navigated using a periscope arrangement, dead reckoning navigation techniques, and meticulous attention to engine power settings throughout the journey. Upon landing in Paris, post-flight inspection revealed that approximately 85 gallons of fuel remained in the aircraft's tanks. This margin proved that Lindbergh's pre-flight calculations regarding fuel consumption, engine settings, and flight profile had been remarkably accurate. The flight established Lindbergh not merely as a brave pilot, but as an aviator who understood the relationship between engine performance and fuel efficiency at a level few of his contemporaries could match. Throughout the 1930s, Lindbergh applied this expertise commercially. Working with Pan American Airways, he surveyed and mapped transoceanic flight routes across both the Atlantic and Pacific. During this period, he refined his understanding of long-range flight operations, learning to extract maximum range from aircraft engines through careful power management. His work contributed to the establishment of reliable commercial air routes that connected continents. By the early 1940s, however, Lindbergh's public reputation had shifted dramatically. His political activities and public statements regarding American foreign policy transformed him from national hero to controversial figure. Between 1940 and America's entry into World War II in December 1941, Lindbergh became a prominent spokesman for the non-interventionist movement. He delivered numerous public addresses arguing against American involvement in the European War. His speeches drew large audiences, but his positions placed him in direct opposition to President Roosevelt's policies. Lindbergh's public stance generated significant controversy. Critics accused him of harboring sympathies toward Nazi Germany, charges that would follow him throughout his life. The Roosevelt administration viewed Lindbergh as a political opponent who undermined efforts to prepare the nation for potential conflict. When Japanese forces attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, Lindbergh immediately sought to resume military service. He attempted to rejoin the Army Air Corps, offering his extensive aviation experience to the war effort. President Roosevelt personally ensured that Lindbergh would not receive a military commission. The administration's position was clear. Charles Lindbergh would not wear an American military uniform during World War II. This rejection did not end Lindbergh's involvement in the war effort. He found alternative channels through which to contribute his technical expertise. In 1942, he accepted a position as a civilian technical consultant with United Aircraft Corporation. Later, he worked with Chance Vought Aircraft and Ford Motor Company, focusing on engine testing, performance analysis, and development of combat techniques for various aircraft types. Despite these contributions, Lindbergh remained unsatisfied. He sought direct involvement in combat operations, an opportunity that seemed permanently closed to him given his political status. By 1944, circumstances finally created an opening. In early 1944, United Aircraft Corporation was conducting research into twin-engine fighter performance in combat conditions. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning represented the only American twin-engine fighter operating extensively in the Pacific Theater. Company officials proposed sending a technical representative to observe P-38 operations firsthand. Lindbergh volunteered for the assignment. The deployment required careful political management. The U.S. Navy authorized Lindbergh's travel to the Pacific under classification as a civilian technical observer. The White House received no official notification of his deployment. Lindbergh traveled wearing a plain naval uniform devoid of rank insignia, a visual representation of his ambiguous status. He arrived in the South Pacific, carrying minimal personal effects, a New Testament and his lifetime of aviation experience. Officially, his mission involved observing P-38 operations and providing technical recommendations to improve aircraft performance. Unofficially, Lindbergh sought redemption through service. His first combat experience occurred on May 21, 1944, with Marine Fighting Squadron 222, VMF 222. What began as an observation flight near Rabaul evolved into an active combat mission. Lindbergh's aircraft carried loaded weapons, and when the squadron encountered targets, he engaged. He operated his guns against enemy positions, demonstrating that his piloting skills remained sharp despite years away from military flying. The Marines who flew with Lindbergh that day reported favorably on his performance. Word spread quickly through Pacific Air units that the famous aviator was not only flying combat missions, but actively contributing to operational effectiveness. His work with Marine Corsair squadrons provided early evidence of his practical approach to solving real-world problems. Lindbergh advised Corsair pilots on safely carrying doubled bomb loads, a modification that increased striking power but risked aircraft stability during takeoff. By adjusting power settings and carefully calculating weight distribution, he enabled this enhanced capability while reducing accident rates. Operational success rates improved measurably following implementation of his recommendations. However, Lindbergh's primary interest focused on the P-38 Lightning and the units that flew it. He specifically sought assignment with the 475th Fighter Group, one of the most accomplished American fighter units in the Pacific. The 475th Fighter Group, known by their unofficial designation Satan's Angels, operated as an elite unit within the 5th Air Force. Based at Hollandia following Allied capture of Dutch New Guinea, the group had accumulated an impressive combat record flying P-38 Lightnings against Japanese forces across the southwestern Pacific. The P-38 itself represented a unique aircraft in American military aviation. Its twin-engine configuration, twin-boom design, and tricycle landing gear distinguished it from single-engine fighters. The Lightning offered long-range, heavy armament, one 20mm cannon and 4 50 caliber machine guns, and excellent high-altitude performance. However, its operational range remained limited by contemporary fuel management practices. Standard operating procedures called for P-38 pilots to cruise at 2,200 RPM with fuel mixture controls set to rich, positions that prioritized engine safety but consumed fuel at high rates. These settings limited the Lightning's effective combat radius to approximately 570 miles, restricting the targets American fighters could reach and escort. When Lindbergh approached McDonald on June 26th, requesting permission to fly with the 475th, the squadron commander faced a decision. Allowing a civilian, particularly one as famous as Lindbergh, to fly combat missions created potential complications. However, Lindbergh's reputation as a skilled aviator and his technical credentials ultimately convinced McDonald to approve a trial mission. On June 27th, 4 P-38 Lightnings launched from Hollandia. Lindbergh flew as Blue 3, the third aircraft in the formation. The mission targeted enemy barges along the New Guinea coast, relatively routine harassment operations designed to interdict Japanese supply lines. For Lindbergh, who had limited P-38 experience, the flight served as both an evaluation and a demonstration. He performed flawlessly. His formation flying maintained proper position throughout the mission. His navigation proved accurate. The mission accomplished its objectives, and all 4 aircraft returned safely to Hollandia. Post-flight inspection revealed something unusual. Lindbergh's aircraft retained significantly more fuel than the other 3 P-38s. The difference was substantial, not a small variance, but enough extra fuel to extend flight time by a considerable margin. This pattern repeated across subsequent missions. Consistently, Lindbergh returned to base with fuel reserves exceeding those of other pilots who had flown identical profiles. After several flights established this as a reproducible result rather than anomaly, McDonald called a meeting of 475th Fighter Group pilots. The meeting took place in the unit's recreation facility, a crude structure with dirt floor, palm leaf roof and minimal furnishings. Lindbergh addressed the assembled pilots directly, explaining the principles behind his fuel management technique. Standard operating procedures, based on conventional aviation wisdom and Lockheed's official recommendations, specified cruise settings of 2,200 RPM with rich fuel mixture. These settings provided safety margins against engine overheating and detonation, but operated engines inefficiently. Lindbergh proposed a radical alternative: reduce RPM to 1,600, lean the fuel mixture considerably, and increase manifold pressure to 30 inches of mercury. The reaction among the pilots combined skepticism with concern. Every flight instructor these men had encountered during training had warned against oversquare operations, settings where manifold pressure exceeded RPM. Traditional aviation doctrine held that such configurations would destroy engines through excessive stress and heat. Yet Lindbergh had been flying precisely these settings for weeks, and his engines showed no adverse effects. Engine temperature gauges remained within acceptable ranges. Post-flight inspections revealed no unusual wear. The engines performed normally. Lindbergh's authority derived from direct experience. He could demonstrate that his technique worked because he had already proven it worked. He spoke in practical terms that resonated with combat pilots rather than abstract engineering theory. His message was simple: you will not damage your engines, you will simply operate them more efficiently. The 475th Fighter Group pilots began testing Lindbergh's technique cautiously. Initial flights remained close to base, allowing quick return if engine problems developed. Pilots monitored instruments carefully, watching for any indication of trouble. None materialized. One by one, pilots confirmed that the new power settings delivered exactly what Lindbergh had promised: identical airspeed with dramatically reduced fuel consumption. The P-38's effective range increased from 570 miles to 750 miles, a gain of more than 30%. Longer missions became feasible. Within 1 week, the 475th Fighter Group had fully adopted Lindbergh's fuel management procedures across all operational flights. Missions that had previously required external fuel tanks or intermediate refueling stops could now be flown directly. Targets formerly beyond range became accessible. The tactical implications were immediate and significant. Lindbergh did not confine himself to teaching. He flew operational combat missions, demonstrating his techniques under actual combat conditions. He accompanied fighter sweeps deep into Japanese-controlled territory, showing pilots exactly how to apply his methods during real missions rather than training exercises. On July 28, 1944, while flying with the 433rd Fighter Squadron, Lindbergh participated in a mission that encountered enemy aircraft. American pilots spotted two Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonia light bombers, reconnaissance aircraft operated by the Imperial Japanese Army. The squadron leader ordered an attack. The lead Japanese aircraft, piloted by Captain Saburo Shimada, did not attempt to flee. Despite facing faster, more heavily armed American fighters, Shimada maneuvered aggressively, using his aircraft's tight turning capability to complicate American attack angles. The engagement evolved into a running dogfight as the American fighters attempted to bring their superior speed and firepower to bear. According to multiple witness accounts from other pilots in the formation, Shimada then executed a head-on attack against Lindbergh's P-38. Both aircraft closed at a combined speed exceeding 500 miles per hour. Lindbergh aimed at the Sonia's engine section and fired a sustained burst from his Lightning's cannon and machine guns. Smoke began streaming from the Japanese aircraft's engine. Lindbergh pulled his P-38 into a sharp climb to avoid collision. Shimada's damaged aircraft lost altitude rapidly and impacted the ocean surface seconds later, disappearing beneath the waves. The engagement lasted less than 1 minute from initial contact to conclusion. This represented Lindbergh's first confirmed aerial victory. Official Army Air Forces records would never include it. Lindbergh's civilian status meant his combat actions could not be formally credited. However, every pilot who witnessed the engagement knew what had occurred. The famous aviator who had transformed Atlantic flight in 1927 had just demonstrated that his combat flying skills matched his technical expertise. Several days later, Lindbergh nearly became a casualty himself. During another mission, his P-38 came under attack from a Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighter that achieved position on his tail. Only McDonald's urgent radio warning, "Brake right," and covering fire from other squadron members saved him from serious danger or possible loss. This close call prompted intervention from higher headquarters. When senior 5th Air Force officers learned that Lindbergh had been actively engaging in air combat, they ordered his immediate return to the United States. The political and public relations consequences of losing Charles Lindbergh in combat outweighed any benefit from his continued presence in theater. By August 12, 1944, when Lindbergh departed the Pacific, he had completed approximately 50 combat missions, including 25 flights in the P-38 Lightning. More importantly, he had conclusively proven that his fuel management techniques worked under actual combat conditions across varied mission profiles. The adoption of Lindbergh's technique spread rapidly through Pacific air units. Within weeks, P-38 squadrons across the theater had incorporated his power settings into standard operating procedures. The operational impact proved substantial. Fighter escort missions that had previously required drop tanks or intermediate refueling stops could now reach their objectives and return on internal fuel alone. This simplified logistics, reduced vulnerability during refueling operations, and increased sortie rates. Escort coverage could extend farther, providing bomber formations with continuous fighter protection deeper into Japanese-controlled territory. The strategic implications extended beyond individual missions. American offensive operations in the Pacific depended heavily on air superiority and the ability to strike targets at increasing distances. MacArthur's advance along New Guinea toward the Philippines required fighter coverage of ground operations and naval forces across vast oceanic distances. Extended fighter range directly accelerated operational tempo. Airfields that had been considered too distant for fighter coverage suddenly became viable. This allowed American forces to bypass strongly defended Japanese positions, establishing new forward bases that further extended operational reach. The island-hopping strategy that characterized American Pacific operations became more effective when fighters could range farther from their bases. The safety implications also proved significant. Pilots who previously might have exhausted fuel reserves over open ocean could now return to base with comfortable margins. Aircraft that encountered unexpected headwinds or had to divert around weather systems stood better chances of reaching friendly territory. Combat losses due to fuel exhaustion decreased measurably. By late 1944, the 5th Air Force had formally incorporated Lindbergh's power settings into official doctrine. Training materials were updated. New pilots arriving in theater learned these techniques as standard procedures rather than experimental methods. The P-38's performance characteristics were effectively redefined, not through hardware modification, but through operational knowledge. The fuel management principles Lindbergh demonstrated applied beyond the P-38. Similar techniques were tested and adopted for other twin-engine aircraft types operating in the Pacific. The underlying principle that engines could operate efficiently at power settings outside traditionally safe parameters changed how American pilots thought about aircraft performance. When World War II ended in August 1945, the P-38 Lightning had established itself as one of the most successful American fighter aircraft in the Pacific theater. Its distinctive silhouette had become synonymous with American air power in that region. The aircraft's combat record included thousands of successful missions and substantial contributions to the defeat of Japanese forces. Within that record, Lindbergh's contribution remained largely anonymous. Official histories did not credit him by name. His civilian status meant his combat missions existed only in unit logs and personal accounts. The political controversies that had surrounded him before the war ensured that public recognition remained limited. However, among the pilots who had flown with him and learned from him, Lindbergh's impact was clearly understood. The men of the 475th Fighter Group knew that the techniques they used daily had originated with the quiet civilian who had appeared at Hollandia in June 1944. Squadron after squadron had adopted his methods based on proven results rather than authority or orders. The mathematical principles he had taught became embedded in operational procedures: reduced RPM, increased manifold pressure, leaned fuel mixture. These settings became standard practice, taught to new pilots as fundamental P-38 operating procedures. Lindbergh's name disappeared from the documentation, but his mathematics remained. After the war, Lindbergh returned to civilian life in Connecticut. He avoided public attention and rarely discussed his wartime service. When journalists occasionally sought interviews about his Pacific experiences, he declined or provided minimal information. His focus shifted to conservation efforts and international humanitarian work through the decades that followed. Charles Lindbergh died on August 26, 1974, at his home in Maui, Hawaii. His grave marker, in accordance with his wishes, bore a simple inscription from Psalm 139. "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea." The verse seemed particularly appropriate for a man whose life had been defined by flight and who had, during 6 weeks in 1944, applied his lifetime of aviation knowledge to immediate practical effect. Assessing Lindbergh's contribution requires understanding both what he accomplished and what he did not. He did not invent new technology. The P-38 Lightning's engines remained unchanged. No hardware modifications resulted from his work. He did not develop revolutionary tactics or strategies that transformed air warfare. What Lindbergh provided was operational knowledge, understanding how existing equipment could be used more effectively. His contribution belonged to the category of techniques rather than innovations. He recognized that official procedures, while safe, were inefficient. He possessed the expertise to calculate better settings and the credibility to convince skeptical combat pilots to try them. This type of contribution often receives less historical attention than technological advancement or tactical innovation. Yet, its impact can be equally significant. The additional 180 miles of range that Lindbergh's techniques provided to P-38 operations translated directly into operational capability. Missions succeeded that would otherwise have failed. Pilots survived who might otherwise have been lost. Records differ on the exact number of missions flown or the precise fuel savings achieved. Unit logs from the 475th Fighter Group document Lindbergh's presence and general activities, but do not provide comprehensive quantitative data. Post-war analyses by aviation historians have attempted to calculate the aggregate impact of extended P-38 range on Pacific operations, but definitive numbers remain elusive. What remains clear from available documentation is that Lindbergh's techniques were adopted rapidly and widely. This pattern, quick acceptance across multiple units and incorporation into official doctrine, suggests that the improvements he demonstrated were substantial enough to overcome institutional inertia and skepticism. The question of why standard operating procedures had been inefficient in the first place merits consideration. Lockheed's official recommendations prioritized engine longevity and safety margins over fuel efficiency, a reasonable approach for commercial or training operations. Military urgency and operational necessity created different priorities, but institutional procedures had not adapted accordingly. Lindbergh brought an outsider's perspective, combined with insider expertise. He understood engine performance at a deep technical level from his years of long-range flight experience. He was not bound by conventional training or standard procedures. Most importantly, he possessed the credibility to challenge existing doctrine and the skill to prove his alternatives worked. Conclusion. Lindbergh historical context. World War II Pacific aviation. Charles Lindbergh's 1944 service in the Pacific Theater represents an unusual episode in World War II history, a story of individual technical expertise creating measurable operational impact through knowledge transfer rather than command authority or technological innovation. He arrived in the Southwestern Pacific as a controversial figure, barred from official military service, operating under ambiguous civilian status. He departed 6 weeks later, having fundamentally changed how American fighter pilots operated their aircraft. The techniques he taught extended throughout the Pacific Air War and became standard doctrine that lasted beyond the war's end. The broader lesson extends beyond World War II aviation. Organizations, including military organizations, can develop procedures that prioritize safety or tradition over effectiveness. Sometimes an outsider with specialized knowledge can identify improvements that insiders have missed. However, implementing such changes requires more than just being correct. It requires credibility, demonstration under real conditions, and willingness of the organization to adapt. Lindbergh provided all these elements. His fame gave him access. His skill gave him credibility. His results gave him proof. The pilots of the 475th Fighter Group and other Pacific Air units adapted because the improvements were real and significant. In the decades since 1944, Lindbergh's Pacific service has received limited historical attention compared to his 1927 Atlantic flight or his controversial pre-war political activities. Yet for 6 weeks in 1944, his technical knowledge contributed measurably to American military operations. Fighter pilots who flew missions using his techniques covered distances previously impossible, escorted bombers they could not previously reach, and returned safely from missions that might otherwise have ended in fuel exhaustion over the Pacific. The mathematics he taught, 1600 RPM, 30 inches manifold pressure, lean mixture, represented his lasting contribution to Pacific air operations. These numbers, rather than his name, became his legacy in the operational logs and training manuals of American fighter aviation.